Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of StJohnsPipeCasts. My name is St, and today I would like to invite you all on a tour of St Albans Cathedral. Now, St Albans gained its bishopric and became a cathedral in 1877, but the building had by then a history of nearly 1,000 years, since it was originally the Abbey Church of the Benedictine Monastery of St Albans, founded in 793 and then refounded in 1077. And it is this refounding that the central core of the existing cathedral can be dated. As such, the cathedral buildings we see today have a history of about 900 years, and the result is not only a very impressive structure, but also a very complicated one, as I hope to make clear on our tour today. In designing this tour, I've had to leave a lot out, but I hope I've retained enough to provide you with a comprehensive guide to the building, and one which will perhaps be of some use to you if you ever are fortunate enough to make a visit to the cathedral in person. Now, the first question we might ask is, why is there an abbey on this spot at all? The answer is that because in approximately 209 AD, a Romano-British citizen of the Roman town of Verulamium, situated at the foot of the hill upon which the cathedral now stands, was put to death by the Roman authorities for not only sheltering and helping to escape a Christian priest called Amphibolus, but for himself converting to Christianity in the process. Alban, it is said, was led up the hill beyond the city and then executed on the site where the abbey was later built. Now, Alban was the first British person to die for the Christian faith, and so his example and the holy relics associated with him became highly venerated amongst British Christians. And this has been the basis of the Abbey's spiritual authority to this day, and during the medieval period brought thousands of pilgrims to this place, and of course their money to the town. The first monastic community on this site was founded by King Offa of Mercia in 793. Having been drawn to the spot after a dream, Offa managed, remarkably, to find the actual bones of Alban, and the monastery was founded to hold the shrine dedicated to him. Unfortunately, the monastery was later destroyed by Danish invaders, and later a Saxon abbey began to be built in its place from the early 1000s, using bricks from the now ruined Roman city of Verulamium. But little progress had been made by 1066, when the Normans conquered England. And it was in 1077 that the decision was taken to found a new Norman Benedictine abbey on the site. And this is the origin of the building we see today. The first abbot, Paul de Caen, commenced a vigorous building programme, and by 1088 the basic structure of the abbey church was complete. It was cross-shaped, with a series of 7 apses for separate altars at the east end. The abbey prospered and grew for the next 400 years, until by 1400 it looked something like this, with cloisters and dormitories and refectories and so on. At this point the abbey church was plastered externally and painted white, looking quite different from the red brick and grey flint of today. But during the 1400s the abbey entered a slow decline, and was finally shut down in 1539 during the Reformation. The monastic buildings were sold to Sir Richard Lee, Henry VIII's military architect, and he went about the task of demolishing the buildings with gusto, using the bricks to build his own manor house at Sockpole nearby. Apart from the church, the only major building from the abbey to survive was the monastic gatehouse, which had been taken over for use as a prison, and later became part of St Albans School. However, during periods of dry weather, Aerial pictures of the abbey reveal the outlines of the old monastic buildings still visible in the grass. The church itself survived because the townspeople bought it to use as their town church. And so it remained until 1877, when it was elevated to the status of a cathedral and acquired its first bishop, Thomas Leigh Cloughton. The problem was that St Albans was a small town and had struggled to maintain such a vast structure. And by the 1870s, the church was in a bad state of repair, and collapse was not unlikely. The building was saved from disintegration by Lord Grimthorpe, a wealthy engineer and lawyer who lived in St Albans. Grimthorpe spent large amounts of money repairing and restoring the Abbey church. In the process, he destroyed many old parts of the building, and its restorations indeed proved highly controversial. But the fact is that he had the drive and the money to save the Abbey. And the fact that it survives for us at all to enjoy today owes a great deal to him. Before we commence our tour, a quick note about the architectural styles we will see on our tour today. Now, as you can see in this diagram, there are essentially four main architectural styles we will encounter. On the left-hand side, we can see a classic Norman style of architecture with Romanesque rounded arches. You have the lower arcade, the middle triforium, and the upper clerestory. The windows, which is the upper level there, are small because glass was extremely expensive and rare. Many windows, in fact, open to the elements. And so we have small windows with rounded arches. That is the characteristic of the Norman style, and that is the basic style we'll see on our Abbey tour, the essential core of the Abbey structure. Next to that, we see what's called the Early English style, which began to be introduced from about the year 1200 or a little earlier. We now get the famous Gothic style of arches, the pointed form, narrow pointed arches, and the windows tend to be again this narrow pointed style that we called lancet windows. And there's a lot of Early English work in St Albans Abbey. Next, from around 1300, we come to the decorated style. As the name suggests, this is more elaborate, arches slightly wider, above all, window tracery much more elaborate and evolved, as you can see in the picture there. That's the decorated style from 1300s. Again, there's a fair amount of that inside the Abbey. Lastly, from the late 1300s, we enter the Perpendicular period. The emphasis here is on straight lines with horizontals and verticals. Window tracery remains elaborate but much simpler in form, again with characteristic kind of tramline vertical features. We will see relatively less perpendicular style in terms of the structure of the building on our tour, but quite a few of the monuments and fittings of the cathedral are in the perpendicular style. So they are the basic styles of architecture we will encounter today. But let us now begin our tour itself. And our tour begins here at what was called the Wax Gate, and this is where the pilgrims who were coming to the cathedral or to the abbey to visit the shrine of St Alban, which was the kind of magnetic centre of the building. This is where they first arrived, coming off the high street here, turning down this passageway, and here they would collect their candles, which they would light, of course, at the various shrines and altars inside the abbey building. And hence there was a shop here selling candles, and that's why we have the name to this day, the Wax Gate. Now, passing through the passageway, the next thing the pilgrims would really encounter visibly is this central tower. Now this, of course, as you can see from our little diagram we did before, this is a Norman building, pretty much in its original condition, built in the 1080s. You'll see that there are 4 levels to it, of which 3 are visible here. At the upper level, which has those kind of rounded open Norman windows or openings, that is where the bells of the tower reside. Beneath that is the second level, again with this, in this case, double 2 sets of double Norman openings. These are where the bell ringers stand to ring the bells above. Beneath that are two sets of windows on each side. These again are Norman windows, simple, rounded in shape, and they let light into the lantern of the building within. So above that level, above those windows, essentially we have the interior ceiling of the Abbey tower, which we'll encounter later. It's a very heavy building. It's 5,000 tons, and fortunately the builders erected this exactly above the bedrock of the hill, and this provided a good firm foundation, and the tower therefore survived in its original condition for nearly 1,000 years. It was so strong, in fact, that later, when attempts were made to bring down the tower by a guy called Richard Lee, who we referred to earlier, he seemed to have tried to build a kind of a hole under the tower and then seek to collapse it. He failed, and luckily the tower survives to this day. The only new feature in that picture of the tower we see there are the upper battlement design. That was added later. And equally, the original tower would have had a kind of pyramidal spire above, which again has been lost. Okay, the pilgrims then would have borne towards the right, towards the west, and as they do so, they would have then had a view of this, which is the north transept of the abbey. This transept again is essentially Roman in style and structure. You can see the upper windows. You can see a Norman window on the upper level there. However, that transept has been reworked significantly. The north face of that transept, with the kind of corner towers with the small little pyramidal roofs on them, they were added by Lord Grimthorpe in the 1870s and 80s. Equally, the large round window you can see there again is a later addition by Lord Grimthorpe. So that transept has been reworked, but essentially it's still in the style it would have been at the time of the Abbey's original construction. As we continue to move westward to the right in that picture, we then are walking down this pathway here, and on our right in that picture you can see the nave extending towards us. If you look up at the clerestory, the upper level of that nave, you will see once again rounded Norman windows with Norman buttresses in between. So once again we're looking at the building as it looked fairly similar to when it was first built. The aisles, which are the lower level there, have been reworked over the years, and those windows mainly date from the 1200s in their original form we see there. But again, roughly speaking, the building as it would have been seen at the time by pilgrims visiting any time after 1088. As we go further down this north side of the nave, heading towards the west, we come across the wall just here. Now this is interesting because this has been extensively reworked, and the reason is that if you look on the right of that picture where those large buttresses stick out, there's kind of grey structural supports to the building, all that is new, and all that was built by Lord Grimthorpe. That whole section of the wall, that part of the north wall there, has been rebuilt. The reason for that is that historically there was a chapel located pretty much on the grass where we're looking at here. Now that chapel was called St Andrew's Chapel, and it was for use of the townspeople of St Albans. Remember, this church was actually the church of the abbey. It wasn't the church of the town or the city. So to provide a place for the townspeople to worship, a side chapel was added to the building, and there was open arcades on that wall for which you could move between the interior into the chapel of St Andrew. That chapel then was, when the townspeople took over the Abbey Church at the dissolution of the monastery, that chapel became redundant, was demolished, and the arcades were bricked up. And therefore that part of the building did quite a lot of reworking by Grimthorpe, and that's the result we see today. Interestingly, you might see on the left-hand side a blocked kind of a Norman doorway. Now that blocked Norman doorway led to the original St Andrew's Chapel, and he's kind of a survivor from that period. I say the original chapel because originally the Norman Abbey ended around about the site we're looking at here. Later on, the abbey was extended westward. The building was pushed towards the right as we look at it. And as the building was pushed to the right, so the chapel was moved westward too. And so that archway there is the entrance to the original Norman St Andrew's Chapel that was then demolished and replaced by a later chapel further towards the right in that picture. So there's an interesting complex story which that part of the building displays. Moving further towards the right in that picture, we come to the west end of the cathedral. And looking up from the southwest, that is what we'd have seen in about 1850. I think what will strike you here is by 1850 the building was in quite a dilapidated and sad state of repair. The west front was in a very poor condition. The big perpendicular window you can see there was pretty rotten and had to be later removed completely. It doesn't exist at all now. You can see in the middle one entrance. Now, you'll be familiar now, those of you who've been to the Abbey, the fact that there are 3 entrances on the west front. There were originally 3 entrances, but they've been blocked up over the years, either side of the central entrance you can see there. And on the right you can see the remains of the old bishop's lodgings, which are again hard up against the south face of the nave. All of this work then, because of the poor condition of the building, Grimthorpe basically rebuilt the west end completely, and that is the result. That is the result of Grimthorpe's rebuilding from about 1879. If you look at that, he's tried to build it in the style of a decorated form. You can see the elaborate windows there. He reinstated the 2 side porches that were original but had been blocked up. And he built this kind of very impressive, but also, somewhat anachronistic facade slapped on to the front there of the west front of the cathedral. Turning to the right in that picture, heading now east along the south side of the nave, we arrive at this part of the west end of the nave, viewed in this fashion. Once again here we're looking at basically a rebuilt section of the cathedral. The reason is that, as I just remarked, where we're looking at here was not originally exposed brick or stonework like this. This is where the abbot's lodging was, where the abbot lived. And because the abbot lived here, his house abutted straight up against the walls of the cathedral, so hence there were no windows, because the windows inside the abbey would just look straight into the abbot's lodgings. Probably not a very acceptable procedure. And so those windows weren't there at all. It was completely bricked up, and those windows were added by Lord Grimthorpe. Grimthorpe also added those characteristically robust buttresses there. And the reason for that is, well, the buttresses, obviously, the reason they're particularly there is that in the old abbey, there was a building here, and further along in a minute we'll see there were cloisters all up against the south face of the nave, which gave it structural support. When they were removed, the nave obviously had a tendency to buckle out because it no longer had the supports on the buildings either adjacent to it. And so Grimthorpe needed to put in heavy buttresses to support that side of the cathedral. The next picture, again looking directly now at the nave from the south, gives you a good guide to what it looks like and a good guide to its architectural history. If you look in the top right hand corner, you will see what you'll now recognise characteristically as original Norman work. You can see the red brick, which is from the Roman city of Verulamium. So that little top right window and the buttress next to it is original Norman structure. As we move towards the left in that picture, we then enter a different style of clerestory. The windows change in design, and you now get the kind of the more yellow brick there, yellow stone. That is from a later addition to the abbey, made in the 1300s, which we'll talk about further when we go inside the building. If you look down, you can see that kind of curious white kind of plaster effect shapes on the side at the lower level. Well, they are the outlines of the cloisters which used to be placed here. This was the abbey cloisters, and they of course were demolished by Richard Lee, and only the remains of the kind of the arcade on the wall survive. If you look down this picture here, you'll see how again Grimthorpe has just rammed a buttress straight down the side, smashing through the remaining arcades of the cloister. Again, one of his more clumsy and controversial architectural initiatives. Again, I think pretty much functionality triumphs over form there. It does its job, but does it perhaps rather crudely. Carrying a little further towards the east, we now arrive at the south transept, which is the counterpoise to the north transept we began with. Once again, this is part of the original Norman building. Once again, we see the hand of Grimthorpe, because Grimthorpe has added again those corner towers, which are not original. They're from the about 1880. And equally, those long, that series of long 5 windows there, which are in the lancet style, they are not original. The original window by then, in fact, had fallen down and been replaced by a wooden structure. That was completely removed by Grimthorpe, and he added those 5 rather odd, very long lancet windows on the south face of the south transept. Going beyond the south transept, we now are looking at what is called the presbytery of the abbey. This was rebuilt in the 1200s in what was then the early English style, though it was later altered. You can see the windows there are new in the form more of a geometrical style. But that part of the building again is more original from the 1200s period, and that is where the altar is inside there, and also beneath there is the shrine to St Albans. So what you're looking at there is in fact the kind of spiritual centre of the cathedral viewed from the outside. Moving a little further along, again we're now heading eastward. We come to what is called the Lady Chapel. This was added to the abbey in the 1300s. You can see some decorated tracery for the windows there. And you'll also note in the bottom right hand corner a kind of extension building, which is a chapel added in 1440, entered via the Lady Chapel. And this was the further extension of the abbey eastward that was undertaken, I say, from the 1300s. Okay, we now reach the the east end of the abbey, and we're now looking we're standing at the east and we're looking kind of westward. And here you can see mixed up together the various architectural histories of the building. On the right hand corner is the Lady Chapel, to which we just referred, with the side chapel square at the front there. As we start to move into the picture, we come to the presbytery structure, which you can see rising above the Lady Chapel. In the left corner you can see the south transept, which we just walked past, and in the distance of course you can see the original tower with which we began our journey. So that gives you a good insight there into the kind of complex arrangements, particularly of this end of the cathedral. Continuing now back towards the original place we joined our tour, walking now in a westerly direction on the north face. If we look up again, we can see the presbytery above, and there I think you get a slightly better idea of the evolution of the building there, because on the right hand side of the presbytery, can you see the red brick, which is the original Norman basis of the presbytery, and then on the left you see the later addition in flint, which is made from the 1200s, as I said earlier. Okay, so that's a kind of, we've done another kind of circuit of the abbey, and we're pretty much back where we started. And this here is the north face of the north transept. And the reason I want to stand here is to look at that door in the bottom right hand corner. Rather unobtrusive, most of us have walked past it without giving it too much attention. But that again was very much the entrance via which the pilgrims would arrive when they visited the shrine of St Albans. So they'd come through the wax gate down to the north transept, and here in this little entrance, narrow down in the bottom, will be their point of entry into the abbey. And I want to kind of, in a sense, replicate that by ourselves moving inside the abbey at that point. Okay, we're now entering the actual interior of the building, and we are entering, in that picture, in the door in the bottom left-hand corner. We are now in the north transept. Now this north transept is fundamentally Norman. You can see the rounded Norman windows at the end. You can see Norman windows on the left. You can see the triforium is in Norman style above. What is new there is the big round rose window that was added by Lord Grimthorpe. On the right, an interesting feature are those kind of large Norman archways you can see, which are a bit odd because they don't seem to lead anywhere, but they used to lead somewhere. Because if you remember, the original building had those 7 apses, which I referred to earlier, the kind of curved ends of the building, and you can basically these were archways, were entrances into these apsidal chapels. So let's look at this one here. This archway would have led into an extension of the north transept into a small chapel. This particular chapel was historically dedicated to the Holy Trinity. Now, these apsidal chapels went out of fashion in the course of the medieval period, and that the apses were destroyed in the 1400s. The entrance was blocked off and windows were inserted. These windows here are actually Victorian windows, but there would have been windows here where the apse used to be, but has since been demolished. So that there were two apsidal chapels on the left-hand side as we walk along, and then beyond that, if you look up, you'll see this painting up on the wall. And now this painting was above a third shrine on the left here, a third altar, which was the altar dedicated to the Holy Cross. Above it is this striking picture of doubting Thomas, who is touching the wounds of Christ to verify that it's in fact him risen from the dead. Behind him you can see quite an interesting architectural set of arrangements of pillars and windows and archways, and this is seen very much as being in the Renaissance style, and seems to suggest that the artist either had visited Italy himself or possibly obviously seen paintings deriving from Italy, because he's incorporated elements of that style and perspective in that picture. This is quite a late picture for the abbey here from the 1400s. Now, as we continue our journey along this north transept, we end up in what we call the central tower crossing. Now, the central tower crossing is fundamentally, again, Norman. You see these great high Norman archways with the distinctive painting shapes on the brick that formed the kind of outline of the arch. Above that, again, is the triforium with the Norman rounded openings. Above that, again, are the two sets of windows I referred to when we looked at the tower from outside. In between the windows, you can see the arms associated with King Edward I. And it's believed that those shields, you can just see them placed between the windows there, may have been painted on because in 1290, Edward I's wife, Eleanor, died up in the north of England, and he brought her body down to London. As she moved down, each place was considered kind of a sacred place on her journey down south. And for one night in 1290, Eleanor's body was placed before the altar here at St Albans. And it may be to commemorate that those shields were painted up there. Beyond the shields, on the ceiling itself, painted in the 1500s, again are a set of arms associated with St Albans, with England in the form of St George, also St Edward the Confessor. And around those shields are alternating the red and white roses of the houses of Lancaster and York, because now, of course, we're in the Tudor period. And so that is a ceiling repainted, but the original design from the 1500s. Now, if we continue actually towards the south in this fashion, we're actually going to enter the south transept, which we looked at before from outside. Looking up here, looking at the easterly wall of the south transept, you can see very good, well-preserved Norman work here. Again, we have in the lower level the entrances to apses. These apses were these semicircular extensions to the building in which there were altars placed to particular saints or the Virgin Mary. Above those apses is the triforium, and above that is the clerestory, pretty much in its original Norman style. Interesting feature here are the pillars you can see in the triforium. If you look at those pillars, slightly more detail here, these pillars are seen as representing, broadly speaking, what we call Saxon work. Saxon work has this look of being turned on a lathe, and those pillars seem to have that characteristic, and they're only found here. There's a few more in the north transept, and it's generally believed that they are left over from the Saxon rebuilding of the cathedral that was commenced in the early 1000s. They've been taken from there and put in here, and hence the fact they've got quite thick capitals. You can see they're like cushion capitals, the effect of which is because basically the pillars don't quite fit, and so they've extended the capitals to try to make the whole thing fit together properly. So they seem to be remnants of the earlier Saxon building dating back to the 1000s. Beneath that, and we just saw the two apses before, the apses that were originally Norman apses, they were originally two, as I say, two altars here. The one on the left was to St Stephen, and the one on the right in that picture was the Lady Chapel. And the Lady Chapel was a very important place, and it had a particularly fine statue dating from about 1200. And that, because the chapel had that very important statue and was such an important place of worship, a decision was taken in the 1200s to make a bigger to cut through a bigger window facing that, where the normal window used to be, an early English window now. This window was cut into the wall and made bigger, and you can see the effect of that is to drive up the window into the original Norman triforium above. So so that was put there to shed more light probably on the chapel opposite, which is the chapel dedicated to Mary. Let's go back a bit. These chapels, again, were shut down during the course of the Abbey's history, and later they were made into rooms. So the effect we see now is a kind of cutting off of the original apse, which was demolished. Rooms are placed here instead, and these archways now are symbols of that, rather than what the original building would have looked like, which would have been Norman archways going into original Norman apses. Looking again at the west wall in this south transept, we can see this doorway opening. Now this doorway opening would have led originally into the cloisters, where obviously for the monks to perambulate and so on. That obviously was closed off when the cloisters were demolished, and hence this bricked up. So you get this kind of wonderful doorway with a kind of little vaulted roof that just ends on a brick wall, because originally that was the opening that led through to the cloisters beyond. If we just go back into the south transept and look now southwards, gazing back, we will see this area has been extensively reworked by Lord Grimthorpe. He basically rebuilt the south wall here. He did two particularly distinctive things. You might, first of all, that doorway there was not originally there. That was actually the doorway that led from what's called the slipe. Now, a slipe is a kind of tunnel structure which led into the monks' cemetery, which was on the south side of the abbey. This doorway was then taken from the exit from the slipe and placed here by Lord Grimthorpe. Also in the slipe, which I say was this kind of passageway into the monks' cemetery, was originally this arcading work on the side of the slipe. Now the slipe itself was in a poor state of condition when Grimthorpe arrived. He demolished the slipe, but he kept the arcading. So that arcading there was then moved inside and placed on the upper floor there, and you can see it to this day situated just there. So this is the south transept as reworked by Grimthorpe, but basically still originally Norman. Okay, we are now going to continue our tour by moving eastwards in the cathedral building. And we're now going to enter the presbytery. And the presbytery is like the sacred centre of the cathedral and placed above the altar, and also extends further to cover also the shrine of St Albans. So we're entering now the real, as I say, the real spiritual centre of the building, the most important part. Now this east end of the cathedral has been reworked significantly. Again, if you look at this diagram, the left-hand plan shows the original Norman arrangement of the Abbey Church. You can see clearly the 7 apses I've been referring to, the round-ended kind of chapel additions. They were then all basically removed because the fashion in Britain became for straight endings rather than apsidal endings. So you see on the right-hand side, the cathedral pretty much as it is today, or had become by the 1400s. All the apses have gone, levelled off straight. The presbytery has been levelled off straight, but then beyond that an addition has been made called the Lady Chapel, to which we will come back to later. So the right-hand diagram there is the kind of plan of the cathedral as it is today. Now we're going to enter then into that central part as we head in that diagram kind of upwards. We're entering into the presbytery. And as we enter the presbytery, we look to the side and we see basically this arrangement of the wall. Now, this presbytery structure here is essentially Norman. But you're saying, well, it doesn't look very Norman to me. And the reason is because when the presbytery was added to in the 1200s, they brought in the early English style. So then you had the juxtaposition of the early English style further east, and obviously the remaining Norman style closer to the west. So they decided to rework the Norman structure to make it look like an early English structure. So these archways here are not real archways. They don't support anything. They've just been cut into the stone, into the brickwork, to give the effect of pointed early English arches. And the same for the windows and the triforium above. So it's essentially, at this point, close to the tower, we're in a Norman structure, but one made to look early English. The reason they didn't rebuild this bit completely in the early English style is because it's up here where the tower is, and if they took this down, the original Norman structure, then probably the tower itself would have collapsed. So they've kept the original Norman building here, but reworked it into a early English style. If we look up in this part of where we're standing now, that is the ceiling we are going to see. Very dramatic vision, I think you'd agree. This dates from the 1280s, and this ceiling is actually made out of wood, and it's one of the oldest and grandest wooden ceilings in any church in England. Originally the plan was to vault this in stone, but that was extremely expensive and the funds weren't there, so they made it out of wood instead. And of course did a very striking, impressive job that has survived. The painting has been, the ceiling has been repainted, but the style is the original and survives to this day. Above, therefore, we're looking at the ceiling then above the presbytery. Again, going back to where we were standing just here, if you remember, then we've looked up here. If we now look left where we were standing, we're going to see this. Now, this is a chantry chapel, and there's a series of these chantry chapels added to the abbey over time. You can see this was added because you can see the archway behind. They've put this chantry chapel into an existing archway, and it was built in a way for the soul of Abbot Ramryge. And Abbot Ramryge was the last really of the major abbots of the abbey, and this was built in about 1520. And it is in the perpendicular style that I referred to before. Notice the characteristic straight lines, horizontals and verticals. It's a very beautiful piece of perpendicular work dedicated to the body and soul of Ramryge. And what would happen is that in these structures, monks would enter and pray for the soul of the deceased with the hope of elevating their position in the afterlife, hopefully helping them make their way into heaven by praying for them on this earth. And that's why these elaborate structures were built, and they were kind of rooms really for which monks could carry out their devotions. If we go inside the Ramryge chapel, we see this very fine fan vault, characteristically elaborate and refined perpendicular work. You can see the pains and expense that's been devoted to this structure. There were 3 niches at the end there for statues. It is one of the finest perpendicular chantries, in fact, I think in all of England, a very remarkable survivor. If you look around the Chantry Chapel, you will see every now and again this rebus, which is the kind of symbolic representation of Ramryge's name. You've got a ram there, and around the ram's neck is a kind of collar, and on the collar are spelt out the letters R-Y-G-E, so we get Ramryge. Not too original, but there you are, and you'll spot those periodically around the Chantry Chapel. Okay, we're going back towards the central presbytery where we just were, where we began this part of the tour. If we look straight ahead, we see this, a remarkable screen. Now, this screen was erected by Abbot Wallingford in the early 1400s. Being in the 1400s in the decorated style, and it is placed behind the altar. The altar is at the front there, and then behind that is this very beautiful perpendicular screen. The effect of which, though, was to cut off the continuing eastern section of the cathedral. So prior to the 1400s, that would have been an open space. And in fact, behind that is in fact the shrine of St Alban, which was, as I said, the sacred centre. So in a way, previously people could have, standing in the nave, could look right through and seen the actual shrine of St Alban. By the 1400s, that has ceased to be possible. This large screen has been placed behind the altar. All the niches were filled with statues of saints. They were all destroyed at the Reformation, as was, of course, the Christ on the cross. All that was smashed at the Reformation, and these statues here were replaced as part of the Abbey reconstruction in the late 19th century. But here we're looking at the work not of Grimthorpe, but of Lord Aldenham, somewhat Grimthorpe's rival in the reconstruction of the Abbey, and he paid for the statues which are found here to this day. Now, we're now about to go beyond this screen, heading eastward, and we enter now we enter the place where situated the shrine of St Alban himself. Now, this is the shrine, which dates from 1302 to 1308. It's made out of Purbeck marble. It's 1300, so it's decorated style, which means elaborate and use of flowery motifs and so on. The actual shrine or bones of St Alban were placed on this kind of plinth where the red structure is seen today, and this is the point to which the pilgrims were basically making their way. You can see the original building would have been painted, and bits of paint still survive now, and the pilgrims would come here and they would seek for blessings. They would seek perhaps to have ailments cured. They would leave offerings. They would light candles. It was the real, as I say, spiritual hub of the building. Obviously, now this shrine was destroyed at the Reformation, okay, and then you're thinking, well, if it was destroyed, why am I being shown it now? Well, the odd thing was this: yes, it was smashed up, but at the time it was smashed up, the abbey changed its structure somewhat. And can you see those archways behind the shrine? Those pointed arches. Basically, when the abbey was dissolved, this became the far eastern end of the abbey as such. And those archways were bricked up. It made into a kind of continuous wall. And when they bricked it up, they used all the rubble lying around. And amongst the rubble lying around were the lumps of the smashed up shrine of St Alban. So those pieces were bricked into that archway you can see behind. And there they remained until I think the 1870s, when again, as part of the rebuilding programme, they found chunks of the old shrine blocked into the wall. So then, of course, they were able to reconstruct it. Did a beautiful job, of course, very clever piece of work here. So hence we can see at least the base. The bones of St Alban have been lost, but the base has been preserved and rebuilt, again, as part of the reconstruction of the cathedral in the 1870s. If we look up here, we again see the elaborate and painted presbytery ceiling we're familiar with already. As I say, it was designed, or it was commissioned by John of Wheathampstead, one of the great abbots of the monastery, and his particular sign was the lamb and flag, the symbol of John the Baptist. And if you look on the ceiling there, you'll see the lamb and flag periodically represented in medallions up on the ceiling there. Going back again to the shrine of St Alban, can you see on the left a kind of wooden structure just peeking through the archway there? Let's look at that in a bit more detail. That is called the watching loft. It was built in about 1400 out of wood. 1400 means it's the perpendicular style with straight lines, which we're perhaps getting familiar with now. And that loft was put there basically for one of the monastery employees to live there. And their job was to basically live up in that loft and cast their gaze down onto the shrine of St Alban, which you can just see on the left there, to make sure that no one was stealing anything, to make sure the shrine was being well cared for and was safe. And so their job was to watch the shrine. And there's only two such watching lofts left in England. The other is in Oxford Cathedral. The wooden structure is beautifully made and is distinctive because around the sides is this carving of scenes from local life of the time, 1400, right? There's a lady milking a cow, and here you can see bear baiting going on. The figure on the left is a bear. You can see his chain on his paw, and before him are a series of dogs heading his way. So it's an interesting insight into how life was seen at the time. These kind of rustic observations were chiselled into the wooden fabric. Going again back to the shrine. Okay, we just looked on the left there in that picture. Now on our right is another of the Chantry chapels, another very fine one. This is situated on the south side of the shrine area, and it's a very elaborate Chantry chapel built in 1480. So again, it's in the Perpendicular style, and it is the Chantry chapel for Duke Humphrey, who was Henry V's brother, and also the founder, of course, of the Bodleian Library. And Duke Humphrey was a friend of the abbot, and therefore when he was close to death, he was able to commission this Chantry chapel in exactly the most sacred place. He's right next to the shrine of St Albans. He's in absolute pole position here, and it's a beautiful piece of work, as I say, in the Perpendicular style, located right next to the shrine of Alban himself. Now, Duke Humphrey's body was placed in a kind of coffin beneath the floor there. Unfortunately, they placed inside the coffin some embalming kind of fluid that was meant to preserve his body. Sadly for him, the rumour got out that if you got some of this liquid and placed it on your skin, it would operate as a cure for wrinkles. And I'm afraid a trade kicked off to drain the liquid from the coffin, and people then bought vials of it to go and replenish themselves and make themselves look young. And so the poor old Duke didn't get preserved because his preserving fluid all drained away. Nothing sacred. Looking again back at the shrine, just to the east of it on the pillars there, these are the pillars that I told you were blocked in later when the abbey was dissolved. There's a remarkable painting which has survived. It's one of the most beautiful and best preserved medieval wall paintings in England. It dates roughly to 1308 and was placed above. There's a series of paintings here placed above a shrine dedicated. It was a shrine dedicated to holy relics. And the picture here is one of the original pictures that were originally there. It was painted in 1308 and originally depicted a bishop. But in 1390, the decision was taken to convert the bishop into an archbishop. In fact, someone called William, Archbishop of York. And the clue to the change, I don't know if you can see this, but can you see the figure here is holding a staff. Now he has a cross staff, which is a symbol of an archbishop. Now bishops have croziers, which are that kind of hook-shaped end to the staff. And if you look where the cross is, can you just see to the left in that picture a little gold bit sticking out? That was where originally the crozier went. So we know that the picture was not originally of the Archbishop of York. It was in fact of an unknown bishop. But in 1390 it was altered to depict the Archbishop of York of the time. Okay, we're still at the east end of the Abbey Church, of course. Just to remind you again what we're looking at. We've been going through that central square section east of the transepts as shown there. We've now come to the far end of that box square shape. You can then see a smaller kind of rectangular section sticking out the end. That is the Lady Chapel, and that was added in the 1300s as an extension to the Abbey. The reason is that by the 1300s a very considerable cult of the Virgin Mary had developed amongst Christians, and the original Lady Chapel, which we looked at way earlier on in the south transept, was no longer seen as fit for purpose. So they replaced that with a new Lady Chapel, a whole new extension. That's what it looks like. Okay, now this was built in the early 1300s. We're now looking therefore at the decorated style, with the, as I said, the elaborate tracery, the elaborate carvings on the wall arcades and so forth. This therefore is a very striking addition to the abbey that was made. Disappointingly, in a way, a lot of what you're looking at there is not actually from the 1300s. For example, that wall arcading is all rebuilt by Lord Grimthorpe, though he did follow the design of what originally was there. Equally, the vaulted roof here, which is stone, is not original. The original was made out of wood, like the presbytery ceiling, and that was then replaced by stone in the 1870s. And the reason so much rebuilding work was done here, so before I say that, let me just say, like on the windows, can you see the elaborate, again, the interesting tracery? And you can see in the window just on the left of us here, can you see those little statues that are inside the jambs of the window there. These represent saints, and they form a complete cycle around the archway. And they were placed there, particularly it's believed, to kind of keep off evil spirits that was thought could enter via windows. So all around the windows are these now sadly mutilated statues of saint figures. Well, the reason this area got so damaged is because when the abbey was dissolved, the last abbot bought this part of the building and decided to put a school here. And so that's what it looked like in the 19th century. That was the St Albans Boys' School, which of course still exists today. But at that point it was located in the Lady Chapel. So it's had a long history, and you can imagine the rough and tumble activities going on there over the years. And so in the process it got quite badly damaged, and hence it had to be rebuilt in the 19th century. Another interesting feature here is when they made this into a school, they basically bricked off the west end of this structure. So where we were just standing looking into the building, there was a wall there. Now I told you already they put in a wall next to the where the shrine of St Alban was, and the effect of these two walls was to provide a kind of a passageway between the two walls they've built. The wall at the east end of the shrine area, and then the wall at the west end of this school now. And the result was a passageway, oddly enough. And if you look there, that was what it looked like in the 19th century. You could walk through the abbey without having to go all the way around it by cutting through this passageway. So in that picture there, to the right is the Lady Chapel and the school, and to the left is the shrine of St Alban, now bricked off. And so people could walk through. And again, when they refounded the church as a cathedral, that was seen as rather inappropriate, and so that entrance was blocked up and it was restored somewhat more to its as it was originally. Though at the time that was quite controversial. I have to say local residents did not approve of having to divert their journeys around and not able to use their old footpath right through the middle of the cathedral. Okay, we've now finished our tour of the east end of the building. We are now going to head westward towards the nave, which is the longest part of the building. In fact, the nave of St Albans Abbey is the longest nave of any church in England, and we're now about to enter this nave area. So to do that, we go back to the kind of tower crossing. If you remember, we looked up to see the elaborate roof there. We're going to stand there, and now we're going to look westward rather than eastward. Now, if we look westward into the main body of the nave, this is the first thing we see. Now, this was the monks' choir, and this part of the building, again, is very much in its original Norman style. You see the Norman archways, the Norman windows above, the Norman clerestory, the painted brickwork, which is original. That bit of the building really captures to some degree what the original Norman structure looked like. However, the pews there, the wooden structures, are not Norman or original to the monastery at all. They are 19th century stalls, but that is where the monks used to meet as their choir for their chanting and singing. That took place just there, and of course still does to this day. If we look up, we see this painted ceiling, again wooden ceiling, dates to about 1400. And has a series of images of shields. Again, there's a one square in the middle there shows the crowning of the Virgin Mary. But I particularly want to point attention here to this lettering effect. You can see many of the squares have these letters, and I always wondered what they were. Well, they are basically what's called the sacred monogram. And the sacred monogram was basically the name Christ in Greek, when it's translated into Latin, becomes the letters IHC. So when you see the letters IHC, as you can see up on that roof there, that is actually in a sense Greek for the first three letters for the word Christ in Greek. Okay, and that's why it's seen as a sacred symbol and is interspersed way across that roof, and also in one of the other aisles up there is a sacred monogram, recurs again there. Okay, so we walk through the choir where we just were, and the next thing we come to is another screen. Now this screen is called the Rood screen, and it separates the monks' choir from the main body of the nave, where regular services for townspeople and so on would take place. And this was added again in the late 1300s. And again, it's in the decorated style. You see the straight lines we've looked at before in the Wallingford screen. So it's a perpendicular style, cutting off again the cathedral. So again, this, going back to what I said before, originally that you had a complete view of the entire length of the building from where we're standing now. But then a series of screens were added. This one here, then the Wallingford screen we looked at before, to cut off the building. The doorways either side there are beautiful and well preserved, and again are original to the screen when it was built in the late 1300s. Of course, what's striking there for us, I think, is the painted statue figures in the centre. Of course, that should be too striking for us because originally the statues inside the Abbey building would have been painted. But that tradition has been lost to us. We're familiar with statues being basically kind of plain white. But these statues here, in fact, are recent. In fact, they're erected in the year 2015 to commemorate the 900th anniversary of the actual formal founding of the Abbey. And when the Abbey authorities, so the cathedral authorities, commissioned this, they commissioned a series of statues of 7 martyrs for the Christian faith from around the world. In these beautiful statues that are obviously delightfully coloured. In the centre you might see, of course, St Alban himself. On his right, looking at it on our left, is Amphibolus, the priest who he saved. On the far left is Oscar Romero, a liberation theologian who was killed in Latin America, I think in the 1980s. On the right is Bonhoeffer, who was killed by the Nazis for his opposition to their regime. There's also a figure there who represents a martyr, a Protestant martyr at the time of Queen Mary, and so on. So those have been replaced as a monument to commemorate the 900th anniversary of the Abbey and represent a series of 7 martyrs. Okay, we now enter what I may call the main body of the nave as we pass the screen, which you can see there. Now, on the left-hand side of this picture, I think you'll be familiar with what I'm calling Norman work. Rounded archways, painted arches, brickwork. What is distinctive here is the very solid and massive nature of the piers that were used in the original Norman building. There's no effort here to make columns or capitals. They're essentially basically great blocks of, in fact, brick of course from the Verulamium. So very strong and sturdy, but not particularly artistically sophisticated, but these at least have stood the test of time. If you look up here at what we call the elevation, again you see the Norman lower arch, the middle triforium, which is in fact a blocked window. It looks like a window, but there's no light coming through it. The reason is that the other side of that is in fact the roof structure of the aisle, so there's no light admitted from there. At the top though is the clear story with the original Norman window, and that, I'll say, where the light was admitted into the building. Okay, so we're looking there at the original Norman structure of the nave, which continued westward. Now, in about 1195, the monastery decided to extend the western end of the nave. Why they did that is a bit odd, because it was already a long nave and they now made it extremely long, but that's what they did. They decided to extend the nave westward. And by 1195, 1200, the early English style had started to become the fashion, and so they decided to rebuild the abbey from the west in an early English style. So let's go outside and have a look at that. Now, in a way you're saying, well, we've seen this picture already, and that's not, I agree, that's the Victorian facade built by Grimthorpe, but that was based on the new style that they added from 1195 onward, when they started to rebuild the nave, as I say, from the west. And the first thing they did is they began with the porches. They began with the actual western facade of the new extension to the abbey, and those porches there are in a way original. I mean, although Grimthorpe was added and overlaid it, we're looking there at where the porchwork began in the extension of the abbey in 1195. And if we go into those porches, this is what we'll see. Now, the left-hand picture shows what the porch looked like before Lord Grimthorpe restored it. And you can see that here he is more restored rather than replaced. Yes, stonework has been replaced and renewed, but essentially we're looking here at the origin of the rebuilding from 1195 of the abbey in the west and the original porches that they constructed at that point. One symbol of that is the fact that if you go to the north porch and look up, you'll see this carved eagle head, or in fact eagle, up on the stonework there. And the style of drawing here is dated to the 1200s. So we're looking here at medieval graffiti done in the 1200s, which has survived the rebuilding of the West End under Lord Grimthorpe, and gives us an indication, therefore, of the history of this part of the building. Okay, so this is the rebuilding they commenced at the West End. As we go through these entrances, that is what we will then see. So we're looking now eastwards into the abbey from the west entrance, the porches we've just walked through. And here's a complicated scene because we're looking at 3 ages of architecture here. Now, we've already been in the top left-hand corner, which showed the Norman arches and arcading we looked at before. But in amongst this are 2 later additions. Basically, to put it bluntly, what we see on the bottom left-hand corner here is work from the 1200s, and on the right-hand side, we're looking at work from the 1300s. Now, let's turn around here and look back at the entrance we just walked through. Now, I told you that from 1195, they started to rebuild this West End, and they built it in actually quite an expensive and elaborate style for the time. The problem is they ran out of money. And so just here you can see the remnants of the work they were doing before the funding ran out. So you see here that, around the pillar was intended to be a series of rounded columns rising up. Well, they were never put there because the money, as they ran out, that work was never finished. Equally, if we look towards the south from here, we can see this beautiful archway that was built. And this archway was intended to lead through to a plan to erect towers, 2 towers at the west end of the abbey to kind of counterbalance the central tower we looked at already. They planned 2 separate towers at the corners. Again, they were never built, the money ran out, and so the archway remains now blocked up to what originally would have been a tower that was envisaged there. Okay, so they ran out of money. And then after a while they decided they'd better get on with the work, and so they recommenced building from about 1215. They decide now to go for a slightly simpler style to get the job done with the funds available. And the result you can see here. This is the extension westward that was built from about 1215 in the early English style. We see the pointed arches, we see the pointed arches of the triforium above, and we see the pointed windows, the lancet windows up above. Classic early English work dating from the early 1200s just here. They built 4 bays like this on the north side and 5 bays on the south side. Again, that's a bit odd, I think you'd agree, but we'll come back to that in a minute. So anyway, this is the extension of what they built to the abbey in the 1200s. Unfortunately, in 1323, disaster struck. During a church service, a section of the original Norman nave on the south side collapsed. I don't know if anyone was hurt, I hope not, but the effect of it was to bring down a whole chunk of the south wall of the nave. If you look in that diagram there, if you look at the kind of what's called the bays, can you see the word nave written on the plan? Look below the V. That kind of square beneath there is called a bay. And that bay, the next one to the right, the one after that, and the one after that, basically 4 bays, all fell down, smashing the actual screen of the nave as well, and causing basically havoc. And so they had to rebuild that section there of the Abbey Church. And therefore they rebuilt it, and they're building now in the year roughly 1323. Now by 1323 the decorated style has come in, yet they didn't want to completely break with the early English style which already existed further west. We were looking at that before. So what they've done is they've kind of done a kind of retro design here, which is essentially early English but with some decorated features. So for example, around the triforium you can see a more elaborate kind kind of cusping effect around the arches. If I show you the next picture, I'll bring it out more clearly. You can see the transition there between the two sets of work. The right hand picture section of that picture shows the early English 1200s westward extension of the nave I talked about before. The left of that picture shows the effect of the collapse of the old Norman nave and the rebuilding in the kind of pseudo early English, slightly decorated style of the 1320s. And quite I think they did a pretty good job of harmonising the two just there. Okay, at this point I want to just look at a distinctive feature of the Abbey which strikes many people who visit and is indeed worthy of note, because St Albans Cathedral contains some of the best surviving mural paintings of any major religious building in England, and you can see them there stretching on those Norman pillars into the distance, frankly. Those paintings form remarkable survival, and they basically date from the 1200s. And the picture on the, basically they go by age. So the picture in the far left here, the one that's clearest before us, is from, I think, literally about 1200. And as we move towards the right, we get later and later pictures up to the late 1200s. So we're looking at a run of surviving wall paintings dating from the original building and built on them and painted, of course, onto the Norman structure itself. Let's look a bit more closely. This is the first of the paintings that we saw there. It dates from the early 1200s. It shows Jesus being crucified. On the right, as we look at it, is St John, and on the left is the Virgin Mary. Those figures are black, but originally they would have been white. The white has turned to black over the years by oxidization and such like processes. And beneath the picture of the crucifixion is a painting of Mary holding baby Jesus. You can just see his head above her shoulder there. This painting was expensive. It was highly regarded. It was done by, I think, Walter of Colchester, if my memory serves me correctly. I'm pretty sure about that. He was a highly regarded artist. He was the guy who did the statue I talked about earlier in the Lady Chapel. And therefore, interestingly, when they came to rebuild and extend the nave westward, they couldn't bring themselves to demolish this painting. And so you had this rather odd arrangement where you can you see above the columns that are meant to be the early English style, but instead of running down to the ground as they kind of ought to, they kind of impact upon this Norman facade, Norman pillar, which is left intact. So you get this strange juxtaposition. The reason was probably to save this important and highly regarded painting from the time. As we go eastward, it is the last of the cycle of paintings. This one dates from about 1275. It's in much better condition, this one. Again, and we have the crucifixion. Again, I think we have John and Mary in the scene above. Below, a beautifully preserved picture showing the coronation of the Virgin Mary by Christ. And that pillar is, can you see a kind of circular shape? The reason is inside that is a blocked up staircase. So that was originally circular, and that picture is the best preserved of the pictures that we can see here. As we walk along the nave, looking on these pillars, there are also paintings on the south-facing side of the pillars. Okay, and these paintings are dedicated to various saints. This painting here, in a very poor condition, is a painting of Thomas Becket. Now, this picture has been particularly badly damaged. It may be that is linked to the reign of Henry VIII, because Henry VIII basically detested Becket, ordered his shrine to be destroyed because Becket had rebelled against the king, and Henry VIII wasn't into rebellious bishops at all, and so he ordered that any shrines or emblems to Becket be destroyed. Maybe it links to that, but certainly his face has been totally obliterated. The picture on the right is a reconstruction of probably what the original looked like. So there's a painting there to Thomas Becket, a crucial, of course, saint in the English pantheon at that time. Of course, the origin of the Canterbury Tales, pilgrims going to visit that shrine. As we go further along, we come to a painting, and this one shows the Alban and Amphibolus. Again, the picture on the right shows that more clearly. The figure on the left is Amphibolus. He is the kind of renegade Christian priest who is being hidden by Alban, the figure on the right, and Alban is giving him his cloak so that Amphibolus can carry out a disguise and slip away, whereas Alban will then take the rap from the Roman authorities, and that's where our story, of course, began. Poor Amphibolus was himself later hunted down, and he was meant to have been martyred at Redbourne, and from there his bones were brought back to the abbey and became another important shrine located here. Another figure here to survive amongst these saints is Saint Zita of Lucca, and she was meant to be she was a servant girl, and she's the patron saint of servants, and again her figure was on one of the south-facing pillars of the original abbey. Now the question is, why did these pictures survive at all the Reformation destruction? The reason seems to be is that they had already, most of them, been whitewashed in the 1400s. I think by the 1400s many of them had fallen into a state of disrepair. They were no longer seen as being worthy of being kept, and they were painted over in whitewash. That meant when the iconoclasts of the Reformation turned up, they couldn't see them, and it was only in the 19th century, when the whitewash was removed, that the original paintings, at least in their truncated form, was located, and hence remain important to this day. Okay, well that pretty much brings us to an end of the basic outline of our tour. This is the abbey in use today, and indeed that picture there shows my own school's annual carol service, which takes place there in December each year. Again, as you see the scene here, I think you can recognise what we're looking at. We're looking at the Norman pillars, we're looking at the cycle of crucifixion paintings and the saints. You can see Saint Zita in the middle there, so I hope that brings that into some kind of context for you. As we go through, of course, any tour will end, naturally enough, in the gift shop. I hope you can find something here to browse and to commemorate your visit here with me. And I'm afraid that's the point where our tour ends. And as we stand here and look back, that is a view of St Albans Abbey, viewed from the historic site of Verulamium. Roughly where we're standing now in that picture is where the original Roman town was, since been obviously demolished, and a lake was placed there in the 1930s. But we look up, we can see pretty much the view there, and of course that's the hill up there upon which Alban was crucified. So I think that's a fitting place to end our tour, and I hope you found it a rewarding experience. Goodbye.